the last session. So this is really the overarching framework which we discussed, um, and the entire course kind of culminates in the fact that a lot of once again, a lot of these frameworks, a lot of these theories uh, need to be taken with a pinch of salt. They're very good for academics, and in case a few of you might want to pursue further studies, this might actually find some relevance. But beyond that, I think it's more of a guiding principle where uh, professionals like yourself uh, can can use some of these frameworks, can use some of these techniques to be able to understand the best practices in the industry. And of course, at any point of time, nobody can guarantee you that the decision that you are going to be taking to remove any uncertainty or ambiguity will actually be the absolute right decision. You can only understand data, analyze it. You can take the best course of action and hope that everything else falls into place. The point that any of these frameworks or any of these theories that we've discussed in these classes makes is that you will substantially increase the possibility of making a right decision when confronted with a dilemma. And more often than not, I think specifically in a lot of other topics around in operations, around operations management, you have process optimization and supply chain management and inventory management. There are a lot of principles which kind of repeat itself. Operations strategy is something that kind of runs through all of these things. It kinds of ties everything together, and that's really where the importance of a course like this lies. Also, at a very early stage in your career, once you graduate, you might not become an operations strategy professional as such, unless you get into maybe consulting. But having these concepts at the back of your mind will help you with whichever role you choose to undertake within the larger plethora of operations roles as such. All right. So coming back, let's really look at the monitoring and control part of it, and it's pretty straightforward. It really talks about different monitoring mechanisms, control mechanisms, which operation strategy professionals put in place to be able to understand whether or not the formulation bit or the implementation bit is on track. The formulation is initially correct, and then the implementation is delivering the kind of results that we had looked at. So we will be looking at one case study later today. It's very difficult to find a specific case study around monitoring and control, but it's something that encompasses a little bit of everything. The textbook that I have shared has a lot of very interesting case studies towards the end, mostly around operation strategy. So in case anyone has interest of studying or going over some of these cases, I think they're very interesting. It's specifically about organizations that have looked at a situation very differently and have kind of appreciated a situation very differently, and have taken a decision or a path which is, I would say, very different from what any, I guess, business professional might want to take, and that is why they've been able to get some kind of result. Always remember, it's very important for your organization, and especially within the operations bit, to be able to strike a competitive differentiation, to be able to understand the unique needs of your customer, and everything else kind of follows from there as such. So last class, we also looked at the line of fit, where we saw the nature of market requirements and the fact that we keep going back to how the market is maturing, how the customer is evolving, what are some of the requirements, which is that market segment that's growing, and that kind of becomes the guiding light for any operation resource capability that we are planning to build. We looked at operations implementation, and we understood whose responsibility is it. Specifically, in any organization, there is a central ops team, which is comprised of two different, I guess, sub verticals, for the lack of better word. So you have staff ops, which is primarily which is primarily responsible for monitoring, planning, and shaping. And you have the line ops, which are those people who are basically responsible for running the day-to-day operations. So the first part is really looking at building the operation capability, trying to understand where is it that the operations team or the operations strategy should be moving next quarter or maybe in the next year or so. And line ops are those people who are typically concerned with running the day-to-day operations as such. We looked at 4 different central ops functions, and we also understood that more or less every organization will have some element of each of these 4, although one would be dominant in each kind of organization. And it really depends on the organizational maturity in terms of where the organization is in its life cycle. Usually, typically in fast growth companies, early stage startups, you have typically the governor, which kind of the central op function of governor, which kind of dominates, where the operation is really kind of having the central ops team has a function of controlling the performance of operations, setting clear priorities, measuring performance targets, and it's really the go-getter kind of a role that the central ops adopts. In the curator bit, you have where you actually nurture the performance of operations by collecting performance data and distributing performance information with various teams, trying to understand.
Sir, sorry, present is taken.
I'm sorry?
Present is taken. I was disconnected meanwhile.
No problem. Who's this?
Harshad Bhosle.
Okay. Yeah, Harshad, you've been marked present. Don't worry.
Thank you, sir.
All right. And moving on, we have facilitator, which really looks at building capabilities through shared advice, support, and learning. We realize that there are people who build communities within the organization, which kind of share best practices around some of the tasks that they are doing. And a lot of Japanese companies, in terms of some of the case studies you must have gone through, Hyundai, Toyota, really look at a very facilitator kind of a role. And then you have trainer, where there is mostly a one-way unidirectional communication, where you look at organizations that the central op kind of trains different people, tries to look at different operational capabilities that need to be built up, and then trains the resources to be able to take over some of those roles. We looked at a case where Renault wanted to launch a 5,000 euro car in its using its Dacia plant in Romania. And we looked at how the organization, the operation strategy had to be implemented towards making that happen, in terms of all the decisions that they took, in terms of all the various implementation bit of the formulation that they kind of undertook. They reduced their workforce from almost 30,000 to less than half, 12,500. These are the numbers, official numbers, but I'm sure that the impact was much larger than just these numbers as such. And we looked at how some of these people were actually trained to pick up certain other roles which were beyond just the plant operations that they were engaged in initially in Dacia. We also saw that the central ops was tasked with training the workforce, and of course that training, they kind of put it at the heart of the business. And initially there was a huge cultural challenge which there was, and finally, of course, the organization was able to also convince some of its suppliers to kind of build within the facility, and most of their, I think 26 of their suppliers were actually within a radius of about, I think, 15 kilometers or so that any point of time they would any point of time never run out of spare parts. And of course, material costs were kept to a bare minimum. And this is something that we had touched on in the class before the last class also, where we saw the case of Xymeter, typically an adhesive company, where they realized that almost 30% of the market segment was a very price conscious segment, and they wanted to cater to that growing segment. And they realized how there would be a mismatch within their brand positioning and within the messaging which they actually communicate with the market. So they launched a completely new brand, Cowdonings. They launched a new brand called Xymeter, where they were able to provide a service which was completely no frills, and we saw that there was no solutioning advisory, there was no in terms of customer support, or there was no I guess any frills that was kind of supported. You had to order way in advance to be able to get the goods delivered to you within that specific point of time. And similar in the case here, in the case of Renault as well, where they kind of used the no frills approach, and central ops was basically the person or the department which kind of took charge of it. Once again, I think in this entire framework, strategy implementation is probably one of the most important ones, because there is a lot of very good thoughts and ideas which are actually on paper, which never really get implemented. There are a lot of monitoring and control mechanisms which organizations have in place, in terms of MIS reports, in terms of KPIs that they track, and there is a review which central ops or staff ops do on a continuous basis. But more often than not, if there is a flaw in implementation, it kind of always results in the organization not performing optimally. And we have had so many examples. And of course, when an organization doesn't do well, or when an organization fails for some reason, there could be hundreds of other reasons that come into it. But one among them always has to be the fact that the operation strategy was poorly implemented or ineffectively implemented as such. We saw it with the case of Nokia. We saw it with the case so many other organizations which kind of didn't live up to their potential as such. All right. There is a slight difference between monitoring and control, and we will get to that in a minute. But when we talk about monitoring and control, let's understand that we are looking at it from two perspectives. One is strategic monitoring and control, and the other is operations monitoring and control. Typically, monitoring talks about the evaluation of activities, plans, and performances, with the intention of understanding where are some of the gaps in the existing processes, or where are some of the interventions that needs to be made, or where are some of these diagnosis that needs to be carried out by triggering appropriate reactions. Any deviation from what should ideally be happening. So you have the ideal customer journey, or the ideal flow of operations, which can be rectified by what we can call as the case of monitoring in this case. Control usually is where it's possible that you're not able to articulate every aspect of the strategic direction. So and more often than not, once you're actually progressing with your organization's day-to-day operations, there are so many changes that happen on a day-to-day basis, on a quarter-to-quarter basis, not just from your suppliers changing, or there being some kind of a delay, weather playing an issue, in terms of your raw materials being delivered, or not just from a day-to-day operations perspective, but also from the perspective of the change in the market dynamics. And over time, you can have a completely new market segment that's approaching, or that's kind of looking at growing. So control is really understanding how some of these knowledge can actually bring about a desired outcome, and using these control mechanisms, which we will look at in just a minute from now, we can actually predict some of the outcomes with a reasonable level of confidence. And we look at how Tesco, the case that we're going to study later today, how they kind of were delayed in their monitoring and control to be able to launch a strategic pivot, which they should have initiated much earlier. All right. So, like I mentioned, there are two aspects to it. Strategic and operational control is different, and strategic and operation monitoring is different. And when we talk about strategic and operational control, there is a further differentiation that occurs. Operational control is typically when you are looking at events that are repetitive in nature. You're talking about there is an assembly line, or there is some kind of a job being done, and you've got to check on some of the progress in terms of the SKUs produced, or the finished goods that are coming out at the end of the assembly line within a unified amount of time. You could also see that the organization takes these operational control interventions as an opportunity to learn and also improve. Strategic control is really at a much higher level. So it's not like, at every hour or at every maybe 7 days, you're actually monitoring the status or controlling the status of the number of SKUs produced, but you are looking at a much strategic level your investments in operational resources. You're looking at some of the some of the some of the investments in operations that might be yielding results, or some of them that might not be yielding that kind of results, and then you would be making those strategic changes to be able to take those corrective actions as such. This is a very interesting diagram. We will quickly go through this and not spend too much of time. We'll come back to this diagram towards the end of the class, because I think it will make much more sense if we have gone through the case study, and then we'll kind of look at it. So usually, if you're an organization that's looking to build a kind of a control mechanism within your organization, there are three kind of aspects that you would have to look at when you are talking about it from a strategic perspective, or when you're talking about it from a operational perspective as such. So is the activity repetitive? And if it is so, you have something called as a routine control, and we'll touch on routine control. It is because it just realistically talks about some of those activities which the QC team, typically within the line ops, you have a quality control team which kind of has some of the parameters, has some of the tasks that they need to do, and that's really your routine control as such. So for example, you might have gone to malls, and you might have seen there could be a paper in one of those janitor rooms, or the rooms close to the washroom, where the janitor actually comes in and he ticks the checklist, whatever, the sink is clean, the floors have been mopped, so on and so forth. So that's your typically an example of a routine control. If the activity usually is not repetitive, it is once in a while, it's an occurrence that happens not too often, you have something called as an expert control, where you would need people with certain specific skill sets to be able to I guess make sense of the process flow, make sense of the diagram, and to be able to diagnose whatever is happening in that particular situation, to be able to help you with a more amicable or with a more predictable outcome. Typically, you have external consultants which come in operation consultants who come in and who look at expert controls as such. And then you talk about the process knowledge, where there again there are two aspects to it. Whether the activity is repetitive, if so, there is a trial and error, and if it's not so, there is an intuitive control. And we have slides on this, so we'll come back to this. And mostly starting from the top, you really have to look at the strategic bit, where the objectives of an organization are ambiguous, yes or no. And there's a reason why I started from the bottom, because this is when you look at from a top-down approach, you always start with the strategy. You always look at what's expected in terms of your objectives, where do you want to go, and then be able to walk down towards this. And then you look at knowledge, you look at some of those activities, and then you go ahead in this. But when you are looking at it from a bottom up perspective, you're really looking at specific daily operation levels. So you're looking at those routine controls or those expert controls specifically, which could go wrong. And there are a number of cases where some of these objectives are unambiguous. And as an operational strategist, one of your tasks on a day-to-day basis would be to make this ambiguity go away, to talk about it in terms of certain numbers, to put in some kind of data, to put in some kind of matrix, to be able to evaluate all of these other things. But when we are looking at it from when there is so much of ambiguity on an objective level, where an organization is not really sure what are some of these steps it needs to undertake, it might become very, very difficult for the organization. So you have, in that case, something called as a negotiated control, where you actually need a certain amount of political skills to be able to navigate the situation. It's extremely, I would say, it's not a very pleasant situation to be in, but you're really at some level negotiating with different stakeholders to be able to agree upon those specific objectives that you're looking to set for a particular process or for an organization and such. So we will come back to this. In any case, I will be sharing these slides here. So in the interest of time, let's quickly look at the next slide. Okay, when the business environment is changing rapidly, which most organizations usually are confronted with, organizations feel the need to detect change by monitoring, and there are typically three elements that you look at when you are tracking performance. You're scanning the environment and you're interpreting the information that detects, and you're responding appropriately. And control is typically when you're collecting some kind of data and trying to interpret some of its meanings, either through pre-existing standards or certain objectives. So pre-existing standards are typically, you could have an SLA of 95% or 97%, and maybe when you're looking at the data coming from one particular store, it could be maybe less than the expected SLA, and then you can actually have different levels of control mechanisms, where, again, I'm not going to go down into details, but you have elements like Ishikawa method, the 5 whys, where you actually go in to try and understand what was actually the root cause of that, and that's how you would be looking to control some of these some of the ambiguity or some of the variance, so as to say, in a particular store or in a particular unit as such. All right. Okay. When we are talking about the first bit, when we talk about specifically tracking performance, we are looking at identifying different elements within a particular operational flow, and implementations with different strategic objectives will have different focus elements. So you will have different organizations and different industries having different methods or having different matrices which they would want to track on. So you have something called as a project objective and process objective. So typically your project objective are those that indicate the progress of the implementation towards the endpoint. In other words, what's the strategy being implemented as planned? And you have process objectives which kind of indicate the consequences that the implementation has on the process or the operation processes that are intended to affect. At every point, you are looking at, from a process objective point of view, you're looking to optimize the process to ensure that the best possible results are obtained. When you talk about project objectives, you have certain predefined goals that you are actually working towards when you are tracking those matrices, so as to say. So again, I think these are really theoretical, a little bit of dry stuff. It's good that you know it, but I think don't spend too much of time on this particular bit. Okay, when you talk about project objectives, like we discussed, you have pre-identified goals which you are actually trying to track your movements or your progress against. And typically you have three kind of goals in terms of whenever you are trying to track the matrices. You have goals around cost, you have goals around time and quality. And I think if you've studied project management, it's typically based on this triangle: cost, time, and quality. And there is the element where you have to make some kind of a strategic trade-off, something which we touched on earlier as well. When organizations have budgets and resources to execute implementation, plus to handle any ongoing disruption to operations. So this kind of comes into the cost bit of the project. And of course, the relative importance of each project will differ for different types of implementation. And if you are looking at maybe an example of an aerospace industry, you will have maybe if they're trying to develop a new manufacturing technology, it will have a much higher emphasis on quality. And so the tracking mechanism for that particular organization will only be focused towards quality. And of course, there will be some element of cost to it, or this be some element of time element that this particular technology has to be launched by, I don't know, Q2 2022, and this is what the budget says, and it should be within the budget. But I think the paramount matrix to track in that particular case becomes quality. So likewise, each organization, each process, each industry will have their own kind of project objectives of importance, whether it's cost, whether it's quality, or whether it's time, and it will depend on which industry you are in and which organization in that industry you are in, whether you're a cost-conscious player or whether you are you are perceived as a premium high-end player, so on and so forth. All right. When we talk about process objective, it's typically when monitored, they measure the impact the implementation has on the process within the operation. And there are different performance objectives, like we looked at cost, quality, and time. Similarly, you have, in terms of process, you have quality, you have speed, dependability, flexibility, and cost. A bit of these process objectives we kind of touched on when we looked at the process optimization bit, and we looked at a particular hospital and how some of the processes that they were engaging with. Okay, and broader measures in terms of when we look at process objectives would typically be the return on assets. More specific measures such as capacity utilization could also be used. So when we talk about process objectives, this is typically a graph which you will at some level be familiar with once you start working. So this graph represents a 3-month implementation period for the performance of each objective that's measured to indicate the progress of implementation. So this is how you typically track, and these are kind of, you can say, percentages. So you have whether or not the particular process might meet a business requirement, whether the process response time is acceptable in terms of percentage, and you have at the start you have maybe it is at 60%, and this one's at an acceptable percentage of 50, and then you have a report finished as promised, maybe at 50, so on and so forth. And then you track the same performance in month 1, month 2, month 3, and you kind of have a target performance when the organization, when a new organization is implemented, or when a new process is finally optimized to its acceptable limit. So again, this is not a rule of thumb. Different organizations have a different way of measuring it. This is usually what's most common, but again, this will vary completely. Again, depends on the organization you are at, and depends on the industry which the organization is actually working with. All right, let's look at a case study, and it's typically it's a case study of around monitoring and control, and it's very difficult to find something which is just uniquely to monitoring and control. So it will have uh, other aspects as well, but take it from the perspective of monitoring and control to understand how an organization like Tesco could not effectively, I guess, at some level, control some of its operational implementation which it was doing. So at one point of time, Tesco was the biggest retailer in the UK, and it had global ambitions of expanding all over the world. By 2016, it had disposed, and from that point of time, when we look at the case by 2016, it had disposed much of its overseas assets and non-supermarket assets because it was not doing very well. Despite the fact that they had global ambitions, they had to dispose of much of their assets. It had been a few difficult years for the organization, for Tesco as such. In 2014, the organization, the retailer, had slumped to a 6.4 billion pound loss, which had brought a barrage of criticism from down by 4% their sales. And while it might seem very less, if you talk about it from the perspective of retail, they usually, the variance reported is in the tune of 0.4% or 0.6% or so on and so forth. So if your sales are down 4%, that's a massive margin. And they had got that had got an immense amount of criticism from different people in the industry as such. Again, because of the brand name and the lineage that Tesco enjoyed, it was still specifically within Britain the largest retailer in terms of grocery sales, and its lead over some of its competitors had been narrowing for some time, and the gap was kind of closing in. Like for like sales, typically like for like sales are when you are competing with, say, a product X in a district Y, in a market situation Z. So that's your typical like for like sales, and we're down nearly 4%. And in the retail world, that was significant. With this background, I think let's also understand that these numbers were probably the worst in a time period of 20 years. Um, and shareholders, including the board members, everyone in the organization, started questioning the CEO, saying that the company had not realized that its strategy was failing and whether it was actually monitoring any of the changes that it was trying to implement, so on and so forth. One critic actually described Tesco as being a juggernaut with a puncher and a whirring rattle in the engine. So it's typically a market leader which has a puncher and the engine's kind of conking off. And to some extent, the organization also realized that it was beyond its control, and it was also, like you said, when we look at maybe a company that's not doing so well, there are so many other reasons that you can actually point out. But it was also a result of their competitor activity or the competition that has been beefing up in the space. So Waitrose, another supermarket brand, was looking to serve the premium segment, the top end of the market in UK, as well as other stores. There are other brands that were looking at attracting more cost-conscious customers, and the problem specifically with Tesco's kind of strategy, or even at some level it was tracking some of the matrices, monitoring and control, was that it was not able to respond fast enough to any change in the operation strategy. So much so that the organization had started becoming kind of obsolete, or started going down under. And when the CEO looked at market numbers, I think they had a typical strategy of building large out of town superstores, and that had continued forever for Tesco. So typically, you have a space outside a particular town which is slightly more cheaper, and that was their strategy for Tesco, and they had continued with that strategy. sharper monitoring of customer behavior, and here we are talking about monitoring and not control of customer behavior, might have revealed that a large capacity units had lost their attraction. So basically, when we talk about large capacity units, those are typically those extremely large supermarkets which run into huge supermarkets which run into acres and acres, and you have an entire floor of of Tesco supermarket, which is kind of going down. Families usually cut down on their weekly trips or weekend trips to the supermarket, and they were opting to go for home deliveries and topping up with their grocery stores to trip to their local stores as such. So if you have a local shop nearby, typically any customer would actually stop by, go down and get it. And mostly for all the major items, they used to be ordering online, and they used to be getting their products delivered um, to their homes. So Philip Clark, Tesco's chief executive, admitted that he should have moved faster to cut back on the superstore openings. So superstore are those typically large out of town stores, and 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 opening, maybe smaller stores, or maybe within the city, perhaps smaller stores, in response to the clear radical changes in shopping habits. He expressed regret, at the at taking time. So he lost valuable amount of time to be able to halt that expansion of the superstores in favor of investment, once in favor of delivering goods that could be delivered online through smaller neighborhood stores, so as to say. And I think again, it is a typical case where an organization reacted late despite all kind of signs being there. And I think a part of it we had actually touched on in one of the classes where we spoke about investment bias, and we realized that investment bias is typically once you have made certain investments in building a significant part of operation strategy, and you also have progressed significantly, which has started showing you results, you automatically as an organization believe that and that particular strategy or that particular way of approach will actually continue working, and that's really an investment bias. Typically, in the case of Philip Clark also, where he realized that he failed to take into account this radical change in consumer behavior, and over time, I think there were about 3-4 years where the organization kind of slumped. They lost 4% of their market share. They were at £6.4 billion loss. Only after that was were the organization or were the CEO, the executive management, able to take charge and say, what, hey, this is something that we should have stopped much earlier, and we should have really focused on either home deliveries or openings smaller superstores or whatever else would make sense from an operation strategy perspective, but not so much focusing on what they were doing and what had made them successful for such a long period of time. So I think this is a quote by Philip Clark, and he says, "Hindsight is a wonderful thing. It's never really there when you need it. I probably should have stopped more quickly that expansion, and I probably should have made the reallocation faster." And I think at a CEO's level, it's probably very difficult for him to be able to make that call. And of course, his head is supposed to roll, because it is at the end of the day, he's responsible for driving sales. But at some level, it's a failure of the operation strategy implementation. Not really implementation, but operation strategy, monitoring and control, and partly that feeding that data so that that operations formulation, that strategy formulation bit could be revamped, and all the way this could be cascaded from the bottom up, from the grassroots level, where you have workers, and that could be cascaded up the way to the staff ops, to central ops, to maybe the head of operations, and bringing all of these data pointers, whatever the matrices they are trying to track. If it is, I don't know, footfall per week, or it is, the highest selling SKU in a particular week, if you were to compare it over week on week or month on month, and that's the kind of matrix that you're tracking. All of these matrices should have indicated this trend much earlier than when this particular organization really took its time to kind of put in place the changes that it had to. Everyone clear with me? Everyone with me on this case?
Yes, sir.
All right. All right. One final thing which a lot of us look at when we are looking at monitoring and control, and I think this is beyond just operation strategy. I'm sure that you would have heard about balanced scorecard in some other classes or somewhere else, but it's typically an approach which most consultants even till today use, and it's really trying when they are looking at evaluating or monitoring the performance of any particular process. That's when you look at balanced scorecard approach. And I mean, this is so true for operations, and it is true for what we do in digital transformation also. When we have to, I guess at some level, when a client tells us that a particular technology or our investment in artificial intelligence or whatever it is going to cost us X million dollars, what is my return on investment? Or what is it that how will we justify the kind of spend that we have? We usually use the balanced scorecard approach to kind of at some level monitor, control, and predict. Not really predict, but at some level reduce the ambiguity of the potential benefits that an organization might receive using that approach. So this is a very generic kind of framework, but when we use it for operations, it becomes so much more powerful as such. All right. Generally, the operation performance measures have been broadening in their scope. We used to have very specific measures, but with so many uncertainties, with so much of changes in the business environment, the operation performance measures or the kind of matrices that organizations track have been broadening in their scope. Typically, any of these performance measures should include external as well as internal. You might want to look at what's on the y-axis in terms of your market outlook. You must also look at internal, where you're looking at building those operation capabilities, long-term as well as short-term. When you say that, at a much longer term, what is the objective that your organization wants to go, and what are some of the short-term objectives in terms of your immediate operational goals which your organization might want to deliver in the week or in the quarter, whatever it might be. And soft as well as hard measures. Typically, hard measures are a lot of quantitative measures where there are numbers defined to some of those matrices, and soft measures are your qualitative ones where you can talk about improvement in brand image, and you can talk about improvement in I guess customer experience. So as to say, you might have certain matrices which kind of quantify, but they typically are soft measures. So it's when we talk about balanced scorecard, it's typically an approach which looks at all of these three factors, and that is why it is so popular. It attempts to provide an important information that allow the overall strategy of an organization to be reflected in specific performance measures. And when we look at the balanced scorecard, you have typically your 4 key matrices. Of course, at the center of the entire balanced scorecard approach, you have the overall strategic objectives which the organization wants to meet. And how do you measure? How do you monitor? How do you, at some level, control the strategic objectives? You have 4 different aspects that you need to look at. You have financial performance measures, and how to achieve strategic impact that could be viewed by shareholders. You have customer performance measures, how to achieve the strategic impact which will be viewed by customers, specifically in terms of the improvement in maybe the customer experience or the customer retention or whatever else that might be looking at. Learning and growth performance measures, and typically to achieve a particular strategic impact, how would we build those capabilities over time? And when you're looking at monitoring, you could look at some of the learning and growth performance measures that you might have built over specific periods of time. And of course, internal process performance measures, where you're looking at at certain performance measures, certain process optimizations which you would want to improve on to be able to reduce, so as to say, the operational flab or any inefficiencies, to be able to achieve the optimum internal performance measures. So you typically have four things: financial, customer preference, learning and growth, and internal performance measures. This is when we are talking about monitoring and control, specifically in this class. This is a great way to look at monitoring and control, and you can actually have matrices for each of those four aspects, and you can have matrices to understand financial and performance measures. Typically, in the case of Tesco, if the organization were trying to build a control mechanism, they could have looked at one measure could have been the financial performance measure, in terms of having to improve certain, looking at the financial performance of a particular out of town superstore, to try and see whether or not it was actually stacking up to the predictions or the growth predictions. And every year you have X% growth. So that could be one aspect of looking at it. Customer performance measures will include maybe footfalls, maybe retention, maybe loyalty, customer experience, whatever other matrices that it might want to have. Learning and growth performance measures are typically, you could have those mystery shoppers, or you could have any of the other performance matrices which could be put in place, so as to just try and figure out what are some of those optimizations that could be done to further improve and achieve the strategic impact which the organization, which Tesco in this case is looking at. And of course, you can have matrices for improving your internal processes, where you need to achieve a strategic impact, and you really need to optimize your process. And those processes, again, we looked at in a few slides from before. It could be in terms of flexibility, cost, time, whatever the other matrices that we looked at. So again, once we kind of establish maybe three matrices for each of these, or two matrices for each of these, and we track over a period of time, it will hopefully be able to help us monitor a particular situation, and also at some level control some of the outcomes that we might want to look at from an operations strategy implementation perspective, and ensure that the organization is still working on towards, is it in the right direction as such. Again, Balanced Scorecard is a very common tool. It's not specific to operation strategy as such, but it's an amazing tool for us to be able to understand and take any abstract situation. And when you are trying to build in measures or build in matrices, you look at four of these parameters, and we do it when we speak to clients as well. We kind of have these four parameters: financial performance, customer performance, learning and growth performance, and internal process performance, to be able to understand what are some of those key matrices which, upon monitoring, will be able to help us understand some of the gaps, some of the loopholes, and try and help us plug those gaps to ensure that we are on track with the strategy implementation bit. Or if not, we can actually feed this kind of data back to the staff ops or the central ops team, who will actually be able to, I guess, at some level edit or alter the strategy or the operation strategy, which again will again flow down to the implementation and monitoring and control as such. All right, I think four key things that Balanced Scorecard measures. How do we look at our shareholders? Look to our shareholders. What do our investors and board of directors kind of look at us when they say, are we meeting our objectives, our targets for the particular quarter, for the particular year, for the particular, I don't know, 5-year period. And that's the financial perspective. What must we excel at, and individually, based on your defined organizational strategy, you will have to identify those specific 3, 4, 5 matrices that you would want to excel at. In the case of Southwest Airlines, you will have to excel at ensuring the turnaround time between a plane lands and the cleaning and everything, and having the passengers on board. There will be a process flow which has to be measured and optimized, and that's something that you must excel at. If you are a Singapore Airlines, you will have to excel at providing those specific customer services all the way from the time the passenger is actually boarding your plane till the time he's actually leaving the plane, and he will ensure that you give him the best level of customer service. So what are those specific internal processes that we must excel at? I'm sorry. How do our customers see us? And that's typically the customer perspective. Are we perceived as someone who provides very good customer experience? Are we perceived as a low-cost carrier, which is known for on-time, departure and on-time arrivals? Whatever that perception that we are looking to build, and there is no right and wrong. Both perceptions are right. And how do we continue to improve and build our capabilities in terms of process optimization, in terms of identifying, even in that balanced scorecard, if we identify 3 matrices, how can we actually look to further improve and build on our capabilities to ensure that, from a process standpoint, from an operation standpoint, there is no kind of gap, or there is no kind of a red area where we are kind of lacking, and if there is something, then that data should be fed in, and attempt should be made at rectifying that as such. All right, inadequately designed performance measures can result in dysfunctional behavior. That's absolutely true, because if it's not your performance measures, your monitoring and control measures are not designed appropriately, your organization or the ground level staff will not know. In the case of an airlines, your air hostesses, in the case of Tesco, the people who are actually in the retail store would not know what are some of those matrices which they will be judged at, or which their performances will be calibrated on. So if there is a checkout guy in a Tesco store, and if it's a peak hour, he probably might have a matrix of having maybe 20 checkouts in an hour, and that's maybe a performance measure that has been put in place for him. And if you do not have these measures in place, the monitoring and control bit, it can result in dysfunctional behavior. And usually a balanced scorecard is a good approach to look at from a monitoring and control perspective. Some of the advantages of balanced scorecard, it brings together elements that reflect an organization's strategic position, and all the key elements and all the matrices that might be important for that organization to implement its operational strategy effectively. At the same time, it attempts to avoid performance reporting becoming unwidely restricted, and there are could be some specific, very specific measures which the organization might focus on, which will not have so much of impact on a much larger level strategy. So it kind of restricts that, and more importantly, it kind of presents an overall picture for the organization in one report on one page. And typically, if you have 3 matrices here, you can have a quarter-on-quarter thing for the financial performance, for the customer performance, learning and growth, and the process performance. And within one kind of a report or one kind of a stage or a few graphs, you will be able to understand how your organization is doing and what are some of the gaps and where they could be improved on. All right, again, I think Mangai and Michael Gould had a few thoughts around how you can control a strategy, how you can make a strategy control system. Again, I think this is an adaptation of the balanced scorecard only, and specifically they have prescribed a 5-6 step approach where they say that an organization to be able to achieve all the appropriate matrices in the balance defined in the balance scorecard, they need to, one, invest in necessary training and adopt appropriate style in reviewing, especially in the early stages. and when you're looking at some of these matrices, they can be tweaked if they're in the early stage itself. Second, once you're looking at training and measurement, your second part is to invest in preparation of before review sessions. Good questions are vital when you are actually reviewing some of these matrices. Set stretching targets, but only a limited number. So it could be a financial matrix, or it could be as simple as there's those 20 checkouts in the guy in Tesco performs, and maybe if you calculate it, it's probably 5 minutes per checkout, and maybe that's a stretching target. So this paper kind of advocates to have stretching targets to be able to ensure that some of the resources are stretched to their maximum potential. Follow through, take it seriously, make actions and words consistent. Very important. Easier said than done. Create an explicit link with financial targets and budgets, and integrating the two together. And finally, show that the operating company benefits from the processes, and give a strong support for success, so that another real benefit becomes an approval of senior manager, and or a better relationship with the center. Again, the intent of this point here is again to showcase quick wins, so that you have the management buy-in for any other ad hoc budget approval or any other support that you might need from the organization's perspective. Once again, the overarching framework: operation strategy formulation, implementation, monitoring and control is a very important part for any organization. It kind of ties in with where we started the course with, in terms of having a much bigger corporate level strategy, in terms of deciding where you want to go, and then you having a business level strategy, and then all the way down to an operations strategy. And then when you talk about operations strategy, you will have the operation strategy formulation, implementation, and monitoring and control, so as to say. Also, when we look at the cross section, you will have different other elements that will form a part of your larger operation strategy. It kind of ties in everything together, whether it's your supply chain, whether it's integrating your suppliers, whether it's looking at specific performance matrices that your organization wants to focus on, whether it's looking at inventory management. Everything else kind of pulls in together in your operation strategy. And once again, I think this course is critical from the perspective of understanding at a much bigger level where your organization is presently, where it wants to go, and how is it that that you as operation strategists will help the organization make that transition. So with this, I think thank you so much. It has been a great time with all of you, and I look forward to joining everyone on Friday for a kind of a review session if you guys are still up for it.